Hello again, everybody. I'm Chris Reel. Thanks so much for checking out this video. Today, the day this video is being recorded, is January the 19th, and that is the birthday of one of my favorite people, Edgar Allan Poe. And so today, I'd like to share with you a passage of a story that Poe wrote while he was living here in Baltimore back in the early to mid 1830s, over on Amity Street with his grandmother, his aunt, and his two cousins. This is a story called Morella, and it's a story that's maybe a bit lesser known. It was adapted as part of a film by Roger Corman in the 1960s, but certainly not as familiar as some of Poe's other works like The Pit and the Pendulum and The Telltale Heart, but nonetheless one of the spookiest, most spine-tingling stories that I've ever read. So I'd like to share a portion of that with you today in honor of Edgar Allan Poe and what would have been his 214th birthday. Now, this story has an unnamed narrator, like many of Poe's works, and he talks about his relationship with a woman named Morella. With a feeling of deep yet most singular affection, I regarded my friend Morella. Now, the narrator is not in love with Morella. He says, I never spoke of passion nor thought of love, but they are nonetheless married. And he describes Morella's erudition as profound. As I hoped to live, her talents were of no common order. Her powers of mind were gigantic. I felt this, and in many matters became her pupil. So the relationship continues to develop. Even though he doesn't love her, he does respect her intellect. And Morella is reading all sorts of theology and philosophy, and she's coming up with all kinds of interesting ideas about the concept of self, that which we call ourselves, and the notion of personal identity. And Morella says that identity is not lost forever, even at death. So these are some really interesting ideas that Morella and our narrator are exploring together. But as time goes on, our narrator, his feelings about Morella turn from acceptance to disgust. He begins to loathe her. He writes, but indeed, the time had now arrived when the mystery of my wife's manner oppressed me as a spell. I could no longer bear the touch of her wan fingers, nor the low tone of her musical language, nor the luster of her melancholy eyes. Shall I say, then, that I longed with an earnest and consuming desire for the moment of Morella's decease? I did. He's wishing that she was dead. Well, that moment finally comes, and we're going to pick up our story at this moment when Morella, lying in her deathbed, calls the narrator to her side. I am dying, yet shall I live. Morella, the days have never been when thou couldst love me, but her whom in life thou didst abhor, in death thou shalt adore. Morella, I repeat that I am dying, but within me is a pledge of that affection, ah, how little, which thou didst feel for me, Morella. And when my spirit departs, shall the child live, thy child and mine, Morella's. But thy days shall be days of sorrow, that sorrow which is the most lasting of impressions, as the cypress is the most enduring of trees. For the hours of thy happiness are over. Morella, I cried, Morella, how knowest thou this? But she turned away her face upon the pillow, and, a slight tremor coming over her limbs, she thus died, and I heard her voice no more. Yet, as she had foretold her child, to which in dying she had given birth, and which breathed not until the mother breathed no more, her child, a daughter, lived. And she grew strangely in stature and intellect, and was the perfect resemblance of her who had departed. And I loved her, with a love more fervent than I believed it possible to feel for any denizen of earth. But ere long, the heaven of this pure affection became darkened, and gloom and horror and grief swept over it in clouds. I said the child grew strangely in stature and intelligence. Strange indeed was her rapid increase in bodily size, but terrible, oh terrible, or the tumultuous thoughts which crowded upon me while watching the development of her mental being. Could it be otherwise? When I daily discovered in the conceptions of the child the adult powers and faculties of the woman? When the lessons of experience fell from the lips of infancy? And when the wisdom or passions of maturity I found hourly gleaming from its full and speculative eye? When, I say, all this became evident to my appalled senses, when I could no longer hide it from my soul, nor throw it off from those perceptions which trembled to receive it, is it to be wondered at that suspicions of a nature fearful and exciting crept in upon my spirit, or that my thoughts fell back aghast upon the wild tales and thrilling theories of the entombed Morella? I snatched from the scrutiny of the world a being whom destiny compelled me to adore, and in the rigorous seclusion of my home watched with an agonizing anxiety over all which concerned the beloved. And as the years rolled away, and I gazed day after day upon her holy and mild and eloquent face, and pored over her maturing form, day after day did I discover new points of resemblance in the child to her mother, the melancholy and the dead. And hourly grew darker these shadows of similitude, and more full, and more definite, and more perplexing, and more hideously terrible in their aspect. For that her smile was like her mother's I could bear, but then I shuddered at its too perfect identity. That her eyes were like Morella's I could endure, but then they too often looked down into the depths of my soul with Morella's own intense and bewildering meaning. And in the contour of the high forehead, and the ringlets of the silken hair, and in the wan fingers which buried themselves therein, and in the sad musical tones of her speech, and above all, oh, above all, in the phrases and expressions of the dead on the lips of the loved and the living, I found food for consuming thought and horror, for a worm that would not die. Thus passed away 2 lustra of her life, and as yet my daughter remained nameless upon the earth. My child and my love were the designations usually prompted by a father's affection, and the rigid seclusion of her days precluded all other intercourse. Morella's name died with her at her death. Of the mother I had never spoken to the daughter. It was impossible to speak. Indeed, during the brief period of her existence, the latter had received no impressions from the outward world, save such as might have been afforded by the narrow limits of her privacy. But at length, the ceremony of baptism presented to my mind, in its unnerved and agitated condition, a present deliverance from the terrors of my destiny. And at the baptismal font I hesitated for a name, and many titles of the wise and beautiful, of old and modern times, of my own and foreign lands, came thronging to my lips, with many, many fair titles of the gentle and the happy and the good. What prompted me, then, to disturb the memory of the buried dead? What demon urged me to breathe that sound, which, in its very recollection, was wont to make ebb the purple blood in torrents from the temples to the heart? What fiend spoke from the recesses of my soul, when amid those dim aisles, and in the silence of the night, I whispered within the ears of the holy man the syllables, Morella? What more than fiend convulsed the features of my child, and overspread them with hues of death, as, starting at that scarcely audible sound, she turned her glassy eyes from earth to heaven, and falling prostrate on the black slabs of our ancestral vault, responded, I am here. Distinct, coldly, calmly distinct, fell those few simple sounds within my ear, and thence, like molten lead, rolled hissingly into my brain. Years, years may pass away, but the memory of that epoch never. Nor was I indeed ignorant of the flowers and the vine, but the hemlock and the cypress overshadowed me night and day. And I kept no reckoning of time or place, and the stars of my fate faded from heaven, and therefore the earth grew dark, and its figures passed me by, like flitting shadows, and among them all I beheld only Morella. The winds of the firmament breathed but one sound within my ears, and the ripples upon the sea murmured evermore, Morella. But she died, and with my own hands I bore her to the tomb. And I laughed, with a long and bitter laugh, as I found no traces of the first in the charnel where I laid the second, Morella. A chilling tale by Edgar Allan Poe, written while he lived here in Baltimore, and recited for you on the occasion of his birthday. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, please share it, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, and let me know what you'd like to see in a future video. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you again soon.